Joining us now is Dr. Kimberly Terrell from the Environmental Law Clinic at Tulane University. Just last fall, she was the author on record for an expansive study titled Air Pollution and COVID-19, a double whammy for African American and impoverished communities in Cancer Alley. So Dr. Terrell, thank you so much for being with us. I want to start with this study. It was very expansive, very detailed. Can you give us some of the key takeaways, the key findings in this overall study?
Sure. What we found was pretty consistent with what we've been hearing from the communities that we work with, and that's that African American and low-income communities in Louisiana are overburdened not just with poverty, but also with pollution and with COVID-19.
And so if we were to take the COVID-19 out of this, I know that COVID-19 is really what prompted this study and the correlation between air pollution, those health disparities, and of course the pandemic that we all experienced. But if we took the pandemic out of that, is there still a problem here that's not being addressed or being overlooked?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know from data from the Environmental Protection Agency, which is what we looked at in this study, that African American communities and low-income communities are disproportionately burdened with air pollution, both toxic air pollution and also particulate air pollution. And those types of pollution have different types of health effects, but they are both harmful to the lungs and to other body systems as well.
And so when we talk about Cancer Alley and this term Cancer Alley, which you use pretty throughout this study, this idea of Cancer Alley, which is a term that is pretty controversial here in Louisiana, but a term that has been adopted by people who are studying this issue, you know, there seems to be some difficulty coming to a consensus on what this issue is of Cancer Alley. What is your takeaway from that?
Sure. So the Environmental Protection Agency monitors air pollution across the country. And if you look at their data, it's pretty clear that Cancer Alley exists, and it's a place where people are put at higher cancer risk from toxic air pollution. And that's really irrefutable. So, you know, the question becomes, how does that risk translate to health impacts? And the challenge is that, you know, nobody has measured pollution relative to those health impacts, and it's really difficult to do that. But what we do know with certainty is that that burden of risk is there. And it's the EPA's own data that clearly demonstrates that. You know, if you look at the map of Louisiana in terms of pollution-related cancer risk, the area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans lights up red. And it's important to remember that that area is not a uniform place. You know, you drive along the Mississippi River, you see industrial plants and you see, you know, rural countryside. So people who live very close to the plants are put at more risk than people who live further away.
And I'm quoting your study here. For example, you say the EPA's most recent National Air Toxic Assessment indicates that across most of Cancer Alley, which again, in reference here, is the area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, residents have a higher risk of cancer from air pollution than 95% of Americans and more than 90% of Louisianians. You say that this data is irrefutable. Then why do you think it's so difficult for there to be a consensus on the issue so that we can move past it and try to address it?
Well, I think it's you know, I think that the conversation gets confused, and I think that there is a lack of health outcome data in our state. So, for example, we don't have good data about asthma. We don't have good data about COPD. We do have good data about cancer, but if you want to understand the relationship between health and pollution, you need to measure health and pollution. And so all of the, you know, supposed controversy around Cancer Alley centers on, you know, looking at health outcomes, looking at cancer without actually measuring the pollution that people are being exposed to. Because not every person in St. James Parish is exposed to the same amount of pollution. And so that relationship between pollution and health outcomes, again, you need to measure both things if you want to understand the relationship. And so the best available data we have is from the Environmental Protection Agency, because what that agency does is they track the amount of pollution that's released into the air. They look at what we know about the science, the health impacts of those pollutants, and they say, based on the science, this is how much risk we expect those pollutants are burdening different communities with. And again, we know that that risk is hugely disproportionate in Cancer Alley.
Residents there in St. James Parish do not want more industry coming into the area. They say that it's just harmful. Industry, on the other hand, says that it's not harmful. And based off of the results of your study, what is the solution here?
So the solution is to protect people from being exposed to toxic air pollution and to particulate air pollution. The solution is to ensure that people breathe clean air.
I have a question, just maybe for my own understanding, but when we're talking about the chemical toxins and pollutants and what's going into the air, is it possible that there are pollutants going into the air that are at a normal or okay level for communities to be taking in?
So in terms of cancer-causing pollutants, the answer is no. There's no safe level of exposure to a carcinogen. And that's, the CDC, according to the CDC, there is no safe level of exposure to a cancer-causing pollutant.
And is there data that shows that there are those cancer-causing pollutants in this area between Baton Rouge and New Orleans that we're talking about?
Yes, so these plants, and for example, the Formosa plant that the residents in St. James are opposed to, are permitted to release cancer-causing pollutants.
It's just so interesting to me because I talked with the chairman of the Louisiana Chemical Association, Greg Bowser, who says, they work with all of their chemical plants, all members across the state, to make sure that they are doing everything that they should be doing by DEQ standards, by EPA standards, and that this idea that there are plants here that are causing some type of pollutants, that are causing sickness, and that are disproportionately impacting communities, poorer communities, is just not the case. What would your response be to that?
So my response is you can't use the lack of data as evidence that something is safe. When Zika virus first appeared, people took precautions. Pregnant women didn't travel because the health effects weren't known and weren't understood. And so if you don't measure people's asthma in St. James, and if you don't measure cancer and relate it to pollution exposure, you'll say, well, there's no evidence of a relationship. Well, you haven't actually looked at that relationship. And we need to look at the best evidence we have and the best available data we have. And that evidence indicates that when people are exposed to carcinogens, they face an increased risk of developing cancer. And there is no reason to think that the people of St. James are somehow immune to a relationship that holds true everywhere else in the world.
Dr. Kimberly Terrell from the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
I do want to just ask you, that was, I can just keep talking to you if you don't mind, but
yeah, absolutely.
Do you get, this whole thing to wrap your head around is just so interesting to me because like in that interview with Greg Bowser, one question I did want to ask you, what is, I don't know if this is actually detailed in your study, but is there a definition of environmental racism that you think is a definition that is universal?
So as a white person, I would never presume to sort of establish a definition of racism, but I think what I would be more comfortable with would be to say that, what kind of the underlying issue is a disproportionate burden. And there doesn't have to be intent behind it, right? What matters is the outcome. It is sort of a secondary question of, is there intent to discriminate? Is there intent to, place a disproportionate burden? But ultimately, from a health perspective, from a community perspective, again, what matters is, is there a group of people who are burdened with more than their fair share of something that can cause health problems, including cancer. Mm-hmm. And so the Environmental Protection Agency sort of defines environmental justice in those terms. It actually doesn't make it specific to race, But certainly in Louisiana, it occurs along the lines of race and specifically in African American communities.
I think it's so interesting because as I try to wrap my head around, really trying to present the both sides of this issue, I talk to, like I say, Greg Bowser, you talk to any state local official and they say, anyone who uses the term Cancer Alley, my response to them would be, show me the data. They say that there is absolutely no data that shows any correlation between anything that's happening in our area and any harmful health effects for people. They say that it's just not there. And so it's kind of mind-boggling when there's so much research and so much studies as yours that show differently and show otherwise.
And it gets back to the burden of proof, right? Like the burden of proof should not be on a community to demonstrate that they're not going to get sick and die from a plant that releases things that are known to cause cancer and other health problems. So it's not like we have zero basis to think that there could be health effects from these plants. The whole reason they're regulated is because these pollutants are known to cause health problems. If they weren't, these plants wouldn't need a permit. You don't need a permit to release water vapor into the air. The fact that they have to go through these permitting processes reflects the fact that they are releasing dangerous substances into the environment. And there's no reason to think that people are not going to be exposed to something that you're putting out into the air by the tons per year from, one particular facility.
Yeah. It's all just so interesting. What would you say, I think, to the people of St. James Parish? Because, even going down there and talking to them, they have this fight, right? They have this fight in them to really want to speak up about these issues and to hopefully, in their mind, save their community. But they feel like they're fighting an uphill battle because the people who are in power-making positions, don't believe that there's an issue that even needs to be addressed.
Well, they have justice on their side. And anytime you have justice on your side, you will prevail eventually. And there are more and more people and more resources and more attention behind their movement. So, I think they're building a movement and they're on the right side of justice, and justice will prevail.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you for taking the time and talking to us about this. As I said, I was just reading more of the study this morning. It's so detailed. It's so interesting. I just wish that there's so much information that I wish people could digest. It's a lot to take away.
Absolutely. And if you don't mind, I might send you one of the residents of St. James wrote a letter to the editor in the local paper last week because the local paper in St. James had published an editorial trying to portray Cancer Alley as a myth. And she wrote a really compelling response.
Yeah. What was it? Who was it? Do you know her name by chance? Was it?
Chastity.
Okay.
It was Chastity White.
Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, it's just. Yeah. I've said it a number of times in this and just talking to you here. I just don't understand how we're talking about facts. We're talking about something that seems so irrefutable, yet you got people saying it's a myth. And it's like nomenclature, right? Are we spun up on the term without really paying attention to the issue, or is that hurting us more than it's helping us type thing? I don't know.
I think it's a term that evokes a powerful response in people, and that can be useful as an advocacy tool. So I think it has its place in kind of bringing a spotlight. And that, ultimately it is based on science. It is based on, what we know about the health effects of these particular pollutants.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. This is going to air next Thursday night in special, and then be online as well. But I'll shoot you an email beforehand and kind of give you a reminder.
That would be great. I'm really looking forward to seeing it air.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you too. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.